We are now 5 weeks into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and at this time there appears to be no real end in sight. I'm News 8 digital anchor Luke Lester here from the Wood TV live desk. Rejoined the live desk this morning after a couple weeks now, Central Michigan University Political Science Chair, Dr. David Jesuit. Dr. Jesuit, good morning.
Good morning.
Appreciate taking the time. A couple of topics that we'd like to hit on this morning. I want to start with Russia's pledge to scale back some military operations. Ukraine not really buying that, the rest of the world not necessarily buying that either. Is that something that we should be looking at as legitimate, or is it like most things in the situation, a time will tell type of situation?
Well, unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be a sincere pledge to reduce the scale of the conflict, and I think that our skepticism is warranted. Just this morning, I'm seeing AP reporting that areas of Kyiv had been shelled. I think the initial reaction from the Pentagon and other NATO defense officials is the correct one, in that really it's Russia redeploying or repositioning its military forces in a way to focus on that Donbass region. It's probably a reflection of the fact that they don't really have the military capability to completely encircle Kyiv. Initially, that seemed to be the objective, was to cut off Kyiv from the rest of the country, prevent resupply of ammunition, food, water, medicine, and force the Ukrainians into a much weaker negotiating position. Essentially, force Ukraine to give up, right? And so that doesn't seem to be militarily possible. They don't seem to be able to do that. So they're going to try to, I think, consolidate their military gains in that Donbass region, and I don't think reflects any desire by Putin to remove forces from Ukraine.
Speaking of negotiations, that was something I also wanted to kind of hit on. You kind of answered it there inadvertently, but is there any kind of breakthrough that we might see in terms of any negotiations between Putin and Ukraine?
Well, I mean, let's face it, there are very difficult choices that I think Zelensky is facing. On the one hand, he could possibly negotiate away the Donbass region. It seems that if he were to agree to a ceasefire and basically allow then Russia to claim that those are legitimate governments in the Donbass region, he could possibly get that ceasefire and save lives. I mean, because Ukrainians are dying. On the other hand, of course, the Ukrainian people don't seem willing to just give up part of their country, and in the long run, it might actually empower Vladimir Putin if he's able to claim some kind of victory out of this. I'm not convinced at all that if they were to say, okay, Russia, basically you have that that southeast part of the country, you can keep Crimea, but just leave us alone. I'm not convinced that Putin will leave them alone, and I don't think the Ukrainians are either. But it's a tough choice. Do you want to stop the shelling and killing right now? If you're Zelensky, I mean, there's a lot of pressure to do that. But then down the road, is that going to create a situation where you'll end up having more casualties? And it's a very difficult choice that he's going to face. I do not believe that Russia is going to be willing to just allow Ukraine to have its territorial integrity over all of their country without being defeated. And so you have to keep fighting. If you want to keep Ukraine whole, I think they will have to defeat Russia.
Well, I guess that poses the question, who do we see budging first? How many more Ukrainians have to die? How many more lives have to be lost there before someone budges on either side there?
I mean, that's a great question. That's where I see things right now. I think there's probably a greater pressure on Zelensky right now because, after all, there are Ukrainians who are dying, and the Russians seem satisfied to sit back and shell these areas with artillery and kill basically innocent civilians. And so there's a lot of pressure on Zelensky to find a way to stop Russia from shooting. So I think it's more on Zelensky. Now, as it continues, however, the sanctions will have an effect, are having an effect on Russia, on the Russian people in particular. And so I think as things continue, the longer this goes on, the more pressure it puts on Putin.
I want to transition now into refugees, millions of Ukrainians fleeing the country. The UN, I believe, is reporting, actually the UN is reporting 4 million people, and that's nearly 10% of their population pre-invasion. What does that mean, for Ukraine and then those surrounding countries long term?
Well, if the conflict, if they're able to actually have a ceasefire, and I'm not optimistic that this is going to happen, but let's say they have a ceasefire. Let's say they extract some concessions from Russia, that they'll be able to rebuild the infrastructure that Russia destroyed. Then I think that you'll see Ukrainian people return. They want to return to Ukraine. And so that this will be more of a temporary relocation. And it's put a tremendous burden on Poland in particular, which has received, I think well over half of those refugees from Ukraine. So if this is over quickly, which I don't expect, quickly being like, let's say 6 months, then most of those people will end up back in Ukraine, I believe. If it continues on, for years, it will be a challenge to resettle those refugees in new host countries. Most of them will probably still remain in Poland, but there's been a pretty big migration out of Poland as a member of the European Union into other European Union countries. And so the United States has said that we will accept refugees here. And so I think that, ultimately, if it goes on for the long term, it's a loss. It's a loss for Ukraine to lose so much of their population and so many of their scientists, engineers, doctors. So it will be hard for Ukraine to recover. I suppose the good news, or the possible good news, one of the things that Zelensky has claimed, or one of the things that Ukraine wants out of the negotiations, is guarantees that Russia will not reject or will not object to European Union membership. And so if there is a partition of the country, if Russia does keep those provinces in the southeast of the region, those separatist governments now, then the rest of Ukraine might be able to join the European Union and enjoy the prosperity that the people of Poland, for example, have seen, or the people in the Baltic states. And it's likely that European Union membership will bring about a real increase in the standards of living for Ukrainian people and protections for their civil liberties. And the southeast part of the region, the Donbass region, is likely then to continue to be poor and depressed. And in the long run, that's one of Putin's great fears. He doesn't want Ukraine to join because it sets up a model of what friendship with the West could bring in terms of peace and prosperity to the people of the country, and people will likely choose, as they did in 1989, peace and prosperity, capitalism, democracy over the authoritarian system that Russia currently has.
If this does last in another 6 months or years into the future, rebuilding that infrastructure there, where does something like that even begin?
Boy, wouldn't you love to see them be able to tap into all the money that those kleptocratic oligarchs have taken from the Russian people? The money, I think it's possible. One of the things that's good about the sanctions this time, sanctions have become smarter, meaning targeting, individuals who are criminals, part of a criminal enterprise that is Putin's Russia. And an example of this, I think just 2 days ago, they seized a yacht there in London.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah. So what if they were able to use some of those proceeds? It's conceivable that they could use some of those proceeds to rebuild parts of the infrastructure if they confiscate, those assets that were gained by the oligarchs through criminal activity. On top of that, Russia does have a great deal of oil wealth. If there's an agreement where those sanctions are lifted, if we're rebuilding, they could redirect some of those oil revenues into rebuilding Ukraine. I mean, that's part of what they're talking about right now in Turkey as well. You destroyed this, Russia, so you're going to have to rebuild this. You're going to have to pay for this, and so I'm not optimistic that there'll be any kind of peace agreement. I think the best we could hope for is a ceasefire, a real ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities, and then we see what happens in the next phase. The big fear that I have, cutting to the chase, is one that Biden expressed and it's been criticized for, and the media has reacted to this as a gaffe, but he expressed, I think, a truism in that really there won't be any peace and security in Central and Eastern Europe as long as Putin is in power. And I don't know that. I certainly don't advocate a policy of having the United States forcibly remove a leader like that. I mean, that's illegal. But he's touching on something that ultimately I think will have to be accomplished if there's going to be a real peace and stability. Now, that is not to say, however, that removing Putin from power means that things will be better, because, of course, the risk of that is that you'll get somebody who's at least as bad as Putin, if not worse. And there are other Russian nationalists, perhaps even more aggressive in their policy positions than Putin, if you could believe it. So there certainly is risk that after Putin, it doesn't mean that Russia will be a safer, more peaceful neighbor.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you just tuned into this stream, or maybe came in halfway, there's a link attached to this link attached to the stream here, pardon me, that'll take you over to woodtv.com. We're able to find this full conversation. Dr. Jesuit, anything else that you'd like to add or put out there?
Well, let's just be patient. I think, as I've said before, it's difficult for me to watch. It's difficult for all of us to see the kind of humanitarian crisis that's emerging and the real suffering of the Ukrainian people. So our hearts are with them. We support them. I am personally struggling to continue to support, for example, reluctance to impose a no-fly zone. If we touch on a specific policy, that's what I mean. We'd save lives if we were able to do what Ukraine wants and Zelensky wants. If we impose a no-fly zone, I'm certain that in the short run, Ukrainians' lives will be saved, and they would probably have victory. The risk, of course, and the reason why I'm not supporting a no-fly zone is that there will be an escalation, and there will be then almost certainly confrontation between Russia and the United States. And so I think, as I've said before, my heart is with a no-fly zone. My head continues to resist, but I'm struggling. I'm struggling with that kind of thinking right now, to be honest with you.
Dr. Jesuit, as always, we appreciate your time. Thanks for taking a moment to chat with us.
Thank you.
Folks, this has been a look at the Wood TV Live Desk. I'm News 8 Digital anchor Luke Lester. Have a great afternoon, and we'll see you around.